The year is 1010. The Althing is in session. The air at Thingvellir is thick with the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and cooking fish. Thousands of people from every corner of Iceland are here. They come to trade, to arrange marriages, and to settle disputes. This year, the biggest dispute involves Bjorn the Bull, a chieftain from the west. 2 weeks ago, Bjorn and his men rode to the farm of a rival, a man named Einar. There was an argument over grazing rights for a high summer pasture. Words got heated. An axe was thrown. Einar's eldest son, a promising young man of 18 named Steinthor, fell dead in his own doorway. It was a terrible killing. It was also a clear crime. The law was plain. A man who kills another without cause must pay a huge sum in silver, the wyrgild, or be declared an outlaw. If outlawed, any man could kill him without penalty. Einar brought his case to the Althing. He stood before the law rock, his voice cracking with grief, and named Bjorn as the killer. He had witnesses. He had the support of his kinsmen. The case seemed simple, but Bjorn the Bull was not a simple man. He was rich, he was powerful, and he had brought 300 armed men with him to the Althing. Einar had only brought 80. For days, the assembly was at a standstill. Bjorn's supporters and Einar's kinsmen stood on opposite sides of the field, their hands on their sword hilts. A battle could break out at any moment. The law speaker and the other chieftains tried to mediate. They knew a fight at the Althing would tear the Commonwealth apart. Bjorn saw his chance. He was technically guilty, but he had the power. He met with the other chieftains. He did not threaten them directly. He just let them see the size of his army. He spoke of peace. He said a long blood feud would be bad for everyone. He offered a solution, a rare and dangerous legal procedure from the old laws, the Gragas. He proposed a self-judgment, or sjálfdæmi. The idea was controversial. Normally, a neutral panel of judges or an arbitrator would set the punishment. In a self-judgment, the guilty party set his own penalty. It was meant for cases where both sides were partly at fault, a way to end a feud without one side losing too much face. It was not meant for a clear-cut killing, but the chieftains were afraid. They saw Bjorn's 300 men. They saw Einar's 80 men angry and ready to die. They chose the easier path. They pressured Einar to accept. They told him it was the only way to avoid a massacre. Einar, heartbroken and outnumbered, finally agreed. Also, Bjorn the Bull stood before the assembly. The law required him to declare his own sentence. He had to do it publicly. Everyone watched. Einar stood a few feet away, his face pale. Bjorn cleared his throat. He said the killing was an accident, a tragedy. He said he wanted to make things right. Then he declared his own punishment. He sentenced himself to pay a fine. The fine was 3 silver marks. A gasp went through the crowd. 3 silver marks was the price of a single milk cow. Well, it was an insult. The full wyrgild for a man like Steinthor should have been 200 silver marks. But the judgment was made. It was legally binding. Bjorn's men immediately produced a small pouch of silver. They counted out the 3 marks and dropped them at Einar's feet. Bjorn the Bull was now, according to the law, a free man. He had satisfied the claim against him. He could not be prosecuted again for the same crime. He had used his power to force a loophole, turning a murder case into a minor transaction. He and his men mounted their horses and rode away from the Althing, leaving Einar standing alone with the price of a cow for his son's life. The law had been followed. Justice had not. Number 15, the fence, was 1 inch too short. Ulf lived on a farm in the south of Iceland, not far from the coast. The year was 988. His land was good, mostly flat and green, but his neighbor was a problem. His neighbor was a man named Skapti. Skapti was a sour man who counted every sheep and every foot of land. He and Ulf had argued for years over the boundary between their farms. The law was very clear about boundaries. A lawful fence, a lagretta, had to be a certain height. It had to be as high as a man's belt. It also had to be well maintained, with no gaps a lamb could squeeze through. This fence was supposed to keep your animals on your land and your neighbor's animals off it. If your animal crossed a lawful fence and did damage, you were fully responsible. You had to pay for every bit of hay eaten and every plant trampled. One autumn, Skapti's prize bull, a huge black beast named Roki, got loose. Roki was known for his bad temper. The bull broke through a weak spot in the stone wall separating the farms. He got into Ulf's home field where Ulf had just finished stacking his entire winter supply of hay. Roki spent the better part of a day there. He ate what he could. He trampled and ruined the rest. By the time Ulf's farmhands chased him out, the hay was a total loss. This was a catastrophe. Without that hay, Ulf's own cattle would starve over the long, dark winter. He would have to slaughter most of them. He was furious. He went straight to Skapti's farm. Skapti just shrugged. He said it was an accident. Ulf told him he would see him at the local thing. At the assembly a few weeks later, Ulf presented his case. It was straightforward. Skapti's bull had destroyed his hay. The law said Skapti had to pay. Ulf had witnesses who saw the bull in his field. He calculated the value of the lost hay. It was a significant amount of silver, enough to buy 10 good cows. He expected to win easily. Then it was Skapti's turn to speak. He didn't deny that his bull had crossed over, and he didn't deny that the hay was destroyed. Instead, he started talking about the fence. He said he had gone out the day after the incident. He had gone with a witness of his own, and he had measured the fence. Not the whole fence, just one small section about 10 paces long near the river. Skapti claimed that in that specific spot, the stone wall Ulf had built was too low. He said it was not belt high. He said it was lower by the width of a man's thumb. He brought his witness forward, who swore an oath that this was true. Skapti's argument was a clever one. He wasn't saying he was innocent. He was saying Ulf was also at fault. The law about lawful fences was designed to be absolute. If your fence was not lawful, even by a tiny amount, you had failed in your duty as a landowner. Skapti argued that Ulf's improperly maintained fence had practically invited the bull to cross, therefore he should not be responsible for the full amount of the damage. The judges at the thing were in a difficult position. The law was the law. It did not say a fence had to be mostly lawful. It said it had to be lawful. The fact that the bull had broken through a different, perfectly good section of the fence did not matter. The fact that one small, distant part of the fence was technically deficient created a legal vulnerability. Ulf was stunned. He argued that the low spot was irrelevant, but Skapti kept hammering the point. A lawful fence is a complete system. A single weakness breaks the whole thing. The judges debated for hours. They were farmers themselves. They understood the importance of good fences. They also understood the letter of the law. In the end, they reached a compromise that was really a victory for Skapti. They ruled that because Ulf's fence was not a true Lagretta, he shared some of the blame. Skapti was ordered to pay compensation, but only a quarter of what Ulf had asked for. It was not enough to replace the lost hay. It was not enough to save Ulf's herd. Skapti paid the small amount of silver with a smirk. He had used the technicality a matter of 1 inch. To escape the consequences of his negligence, Ulf had to spend the winter slaughtering his best animals. He had followed the spirit of the law, but Skapti had exploited the letter of it, and in a court of law, the letter was what mattered most. Number 14, the summons was spoken after the sun had set. The year was 1021. In the northern fjords, a man named Ketil the merchant had a dispute with a fisherman named Grim. Grim had agreed to sell Ketil his entire summer's catch of dried cod for a set price, but when a ship from Norway offered Grim double the price, he sold the fish to them instead. Ketil lost a lot of money. He was angry. The two men argued on the docks. Grim insulted Ketil, calling him a cheat. Ketil, in a fit of rage, drew the short axe from his belt and struck Grim in the arm. The wound was not fatal, but it was serious. Grim would not be able to fish for months. This was a clear case of assault. Grim and his family wanted justice. They planned to prosecute Ketil at the Althing the following summer, but first they had to follow the procedure. And the procedure was very, very specific. The first step was the summons. The Stefna, the plaintiff, Grim, had to go to the defendant's legal home. He had to take at least 2 witnesses with him. There, he had to stand before the main door and formally summon Kettle to the thing. He had to name Ketil by his full name. He had to name himself as the prosecutor. He had to state the exact charge. He had to name the specific court at the Althing where the case would be heard. And all of this had to be done in a loud, clear voice in front of the witnesses. There was another rule, one that seemed minor. The summons had to be completed during daylight. The law specified that it must happen between the moment the sun was fully visible in the morning and the moment before it disappeared in the evening. Grim knew the rules. He gathered his 2 cousins as witnesses and set out for Kettle's farm. It was a long walk, and they were delayed by a flooded river. They arrived at Kettle's farmstead late in the day. The sun was already low in the sky, a red ball hanging over the western mountains. They were in a hurry. They walked up to the longhouse. Ketil was inside. He refused to come out. Grim didn't care. He stood before the door and began the formal summons. He was nervous, and he spoke quickly. His cousins stood beside him, listening carefully. He recited the entire formula, naming the names, the charge of unlawful wounding, and the court. He finished the last sentence just as the final sliver of the sun vanished behind the highest peak. He had done it. The summons was delivered, or so he thought. The next summer, at the Althing, Grim brought his case before the court. He presented his evidence. He showed the judges his scarred arm. His witnesses swore that they had seen Ketil strike the blow. Everything seemed to be in order. Then Ketil's legal advocate stood up. The advocate was a sly, clever man from a powerful family. He did not talk about the axe or the wound. He talked about the sun. He called Grim's own cousins as witnesses. He asked them, one by one, to describe the summons. They told the story just as it had happened. They described their long walk, the flooded river, and their late arrival. The advocate then asked a simple question. When your cousin Grim spoke the final words of the summons, naming the court, where was the sun? The first cousin hesitated. He admitted that the sun was very low. The second cousin, an honest man, stated it plainly. The sun had just gone down behind the mountain when he finished speaking. The advocate turned to the judges. His argument was simple. The law says a summons must be delivered in daylight. The final, essential part of this summons was spoken after the sun had set. Therefore, the summons was not legally valid. The entire procedure was flawed from the very beginning. He moved to have the case dismissed. Grim was outraged. He shouted that this was a trick. The summons was only a few seconds late. Everyone knew Kettle was guilty, but the judges were bound by the law as it was written. The rules of procedure were not suggestions. They were rigid. A mistake in the summons, no matter how small, invalidated the entire case. A proper summons was the foundation upon which a legal case was built. Without it, there was nothing. The judges conferred. Reluctantly, they agreed with Ketil's advocate. The summons was faulty. The case was dismissed. Ketil the merchant walked free. He had not been found innocent. He had simply not been properly prosecuted. Because Grim had misjudged the timing of a sunset by a matter of seconds, he had lost his chance for justice. He would have to wait an entire year to try again, and he would have to perform the summons perfectly the next time. The loophole wasn't in the law about assault. It was in the laws about how you were allowed to talk about the assault. For number 13, his only witness was also his second cousin. The year was 995. The dispute was over a piece of prime grazing land in a valley known for its lush summer grass. The land was held by an old farmer named Thorkel, but a local chieftain, a powerful and ambitious man named Snorri, decided he wanted it. Snorri couldn't just take the land by force. That would cause a feud, and Snorri preferred to use the law as his weapon. He devised a claim. He announced that his great-grandfather had made a verbal agreement with Thorkel's grandfather. He claimed the land was not sold, but leased for a period of 99 years. Now, he argued, the lease was up, and the land should return to his family. It was a complete fabrication, but in an age without written deeds for every transaction, proving it was a lie was difficult. It came down to memory and witnesses. Thorkel knew the claim was false. His father had told him the story of how his grandfather had bought the land outright, paying for it with 3 large silver brooches and a fine Norwegian axe. The problem was that the only other person alive who had heard this story directly from Thorkel's grandfather was Thorkel's older brother, a man named Flosi. Flosi was a respected man, known for his honesty. His testimony would be crucial. The case came before the local thing. Snorri presented his claim, bringing forward 2 of his own men who swore they had heard Snorri's father talk about this supposed 99-year lease. You know, it was weak evidence, but it was something. Then Thorkel presented his defense. He told the story of the sale. He described the silver brooches and the axe. Then he called his only witness, his brother Flosi. Flosi walked to the center of the assembly. He prepared to swear an oath and tell the court what he knew to be the truth. But before he could speak, Snorri's lawman stood up. He held a long, knotted piece of string. It was a genealogy chart, a way of tracking kinship. He asked Flosi to state his father's name and his grandfather's name. Flosi did so. The lawman then recited Snorri's lineage. He then addressed the judges. He pointed out that the law on witnesses was very strict. A person could not act as a witness in a case involving their own kin. The law laid out the prohibited degrees of relation very precisely. You could not be a witness for your father, your son, your brother, or your first cousin. Most people knew this. But the law went further. It also disqualified second cousins. The relationship between Thorkel and Flosi was obvious. They were brothers. They shared the same father. The law was absolute. A man could not be a witness in his brother's case. Thorkel was devastated. He had assumed his brother's testimony would be allowed. Flosi was known for his honor. No one believed he would lie, even for his own brother, but the law was not about whether a witness was honest. It was about whether a witness was legally qualified. A brother was not qualified. Snorri's lawman pressed the point. Thorkel has no other witnesses, he said to the judges. He has only his own word against the testimony of 2 sworn men. His only supporting witness is legally barred from speaking. But the judges had no choice. They had to follow the rule. They officially disqualified Flosi. He was ordered to stand down without giving his testimony. The case collapsed. It was now Snorri's 2 witnesses against Thorkel's unproven story. The court ruled in Snorri's favor. He was granted ownership of the valuable grazing land. Snorri hadn't won by proving his claim was true. He had won by making it impossible for Thorkel to prove it was false. He had exploited a loophole designed to prevent families from conspiring to give false testimony. He used a rule meant to ensure fairness to achieve a deeply unfair result. Thorkel lost his land not because he was wrong, but because his only witness was the person who knew the truth best, his own brother. Number 12. A coward's accusation is a weapon. Egil Skallagrimsson was one of the most famous Vikings of the 10th century. He was a poet, a warrior, and a man with a fearsome temper. He was also a master of the law. One story from his saga shows how he could twist legal customs to his advantage. Around the year 947, Egil was in Norway. He had a claim to a large inheritance there through his wife Asgerd. But the land had been seized by the king, Eric Bloodaxe, and given to a man named Berg Onund. Egil decided to pursue his claim legally. He brought his case to the Gulating, the great assembly for western Norway. Egil stood before the assembly and laid out his case. He had the documents and the genealogy to prove his wife's right to the land, but Berg Onund was a friend of the king. He had the king's power behind him. He simply denied the claim. The court was filled with the king's supporters, and it was clear to Egil that he would not get a fair hearing. The judges were stalling, preparing to rule against him. Egil saw that the legal path was blocked, so he switched tactics. He used a different kind of law, the law of honor and dueling. He strode to the center of the court. He looked directly at Berg Onund, and he challenged him to a holmgang, a formal duel, to let the gods decide the owner of the land. This was a dramatic move. A holmgang was a serious affair fought on a small island or a marked-off hide. The rules were strict. The outcome was legally binding. It was a way to settle disputes that could not be solved in court. Berg Onund was in a trap. He was a warrior, but Eagle was legendary. The chances of Berg Onan surviving a duel with Eagle were close to zero. But to refuse a formal challenge was an act of profound cowardice. It would destroy his reputation. He would be seen as a man without honor. Berg Onan, sweating, refused the duel. He said he would not fight a troublemaker like Eagle. He tried to make it sound like he was taking the high road. This was the moment Egil had been waiting for. The instant Berg Onan refused the challenge, Egil exploited another deep-seated legal and social rule. He formally declared Berg Onan to be a Nightinger. A Nightinger was a social outcast, a villain, a scoundrel. The term was a formal legal accusation. A man who refused a legitimate challenge to a duel could be legally branded with this term. It stripped him of his honor and many of his legal rights. It was the ultimate insult, but Egil went further. The law often gave a man who had been wronged the right to take matters into his own hands if the courts failed him. By refusing the duel, Berg Onan had, in a way, proven himself to be a lawless man. Egil used this as a pretext. He declared that since Berg Onan was a Nightinger, who would neither fight nor follow the law, he, Egil, was now free from all legal restraint. He didn't wait for the court's permission. He turned and, with his followers, stormed out of the assembly. He was now operating outside the law, but he had created a legal justification for it. He had offered a legal solution, the duel, been refused, and then used that refusal to declare his opponent a villain unworthy of the law's protection. Later, Egil and his men ambushed and killed Berg Onan and several of the king's men, including one of the king's sons. He then took the wealth from their farm. In a normal context, this would be murder and robbery, making Egil an outlaw. But because he had cleverly manipulated the legal situation at the Thingby, challenging Berg Onan and then branding him a Nightinger for refusing, he could frame his actions as a form of justified private justice against a man who had placed himself outside the social and legal order. He had turned his opponent's cowardice into a legal weapon that he used to justify a violent rampage. Number 11. He was declared an outlaw, but only in one district. In the early 11th century, Icelandic law had two main levels of outlawry. The most severe was skaganger, or forest going. A full outlaw was a man outside of all legal protection. He had to leave society entirely, his property was seized, his marriage was dissolved. Anyone could kill him without penalty, and anyone who helped him would also be declared an outlaw. It was a social death sentence, but there was a lesser form of outlawry known as fjorbogsgarder. This was a limited or regional outlawry. A man sentenced to this was still a criminal, but the consequences were less severe. He had to pay a large fine, the fjorbogsgarder, which means life ring payment. He was banished, but usually only for 3 years. Crucially, he was given 3 designated sanctuaries, often the farms of his kinsmen, where he could legally stay. And he was also given a set amount of time to leave Iceland. While he was a lesser outlaw, he was not free game for anyone to kill, at least not immediately. This distinction created a loophole that a clever man could exploit. A powerful chieftain, if he couldn't get an enemy acquitted, would work to get the sentence reduced from full outlawry to the lesser form. Consider the story of Gudmund the Powerful, a major chieftain in northern Iceland around the year 1025. One of his followers, a hot-headed young man named Halli, got into a fight at a horse race and killed a man from a rival family. The killing was witnessed by many. There was no doubt of Halli's guilt. The dead man's family, led by a man named Einar, demanded full outlawry at the Althing. Gudmund knew he couldn't get Halli declared innocent. The evidence was too strong. A feud was brewing, and if Halli was declared a full outlaw, Gudmund's enemies would have a legal right to hunt him down and kill him, which would force Gudmund to retaliate, leading to more bloodshed. So Gudmund shifted his legal strategy. He did not argue that Halli was innocent. Instead, he and his lawyers began to argue about the circumstances of the killing. They admitted Halli struck the blow. but they claimed it was not unprovoked. They brought witnesses who said the dead man had insulted Hallie's horse. They brought other witnesses who claimed the dead man had shoved Hallie first. They painted the killing not as a malicious act, but as the tragic result of a heated argument that got out of hand. They were building a case for mitigation. Their goal was to convince the judges that while Hallie was guilty, his crime did not deserve the ultimate punishment of Skogangr. They argued that he was a young man of otherwise good character who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion. Einar and his family argued back. They said an insult was no excuse for a killing. They pushed for the harshest penalty. The court at the Althing was deadlocked. Gudmund's power and influence were matched against Einar's righteous anger and the clear facts of the case. This is where the negotiation began. Behind the scenes, chieftains who wanted to avoid a major conflict began to broker a deal. They went to Einar. They told him that if he continued to demand full outlawry, Gudmund would never agree. The court would remain deadlocked, and the result would be an open battle right there at the Althing. They proposed a compromise sentence Hallie to the lesser outlawry Fjorbogsgarder. Einar was reluctant. But he also saw the reality of the situation. Gudmund's power meant he could disrupt the legal process indefinitely. A lesser outlawry was better than no conviction at all. He would get a large payment of silver. Hallie would be banished from Iceland for 3 years. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Einar agreed. In court, the verdict was announced. Hallie was found guilty. He was sentenced to Fjorbogsgarder. He had to pay the full wergild to Einar's family. He was forbidden from coming within an arrow's flight of his victim's family's home. He was given safe passage to a ship and had to leave Iceland by the end of the summer. For Hallie, it was a huge victory. And he was alive. His property was not permanently confiscated. He could, in 3 years, return to Iceland a free man. Gudmund the Powerful had used his influence not to deny the crime, but to redefine its consequences. He had taken a situation that should have ended with a death sentence and turned it into a temporary exile and a financial penalty. The loophole was not in whether a man was guilty, but in the fine legal shades of how guilty he was. Number 10, he paid for the wound, not the insult. Viking law was incredibly specific about physical injuries. The law codes, like the Norwegian Gulathing law, read like a price list for the human body. There was a set fine for losing a tooth. There was another, higher fine for losing a thumb. A wound that exposed the brain or bone marrow was more expensive than a simple flesh wound. The system was called bot, or compensation. The idea was to replace blood feuds with monetary payments. This detailed system, however, created an interesting loophole. The law was very good at calculating the price of a physical wound. It was less good at calculating the price of the insult that came with it. A clever man could inflict an injury that was physically minor but socially humiliating and get away with paying a very small fine. Let's imagine a farmer named Finn in the year 970. He has a long-running feud with his neighbor, a boastful man named Hrolf. Hrolf has insulted Finn publicly at the local thing, calling him a poor farmer whose sheep are thin. Finn is deeply offended, but Hrolf is a better fighter and has more powerful friends. A direct fight would be foolish. Finn broods on the insult for weeks. He wants revenge, but he wants it to be legal. He consults an old man in his family who knows the laws. The old man gives him an idea. A few days later, Finn confronts Hrolf on the path between their farms. He doesn't bring a sword or an axe. He brings a small, sharp knife. He insults Hrolf back. Hrolf, as expected, shoves Finn. A fight breaks out. In the scuffle, Finn uses his knife, but he doesn't stab Hrolf in the chest or the gut. Or he makes a quick, precise slice across the bridge of Hrolf's nose. The wound is shallow, it barely bleeds. It's not dangerous, but it will leave a permanent, ugly scar right in the middle of Hrolf's face. For a proud man like Hrolf, this is a terrible humiliation. Every time he looks at his reflection, every time he speaks to someone, the scar will be there, a reminder of his clash with Finn. Hrolf is enraged. He takes Finn to court, he stands before the judges and shows them his face. He demands a huge compensation payment for the disfigurement and the dishonor. Finn, however, is prepared. He admits to the act. He says he is willing to pay the lawful bot. His legal expert then argues the case. He tells the judges to consult the law code. The law specifies fines based on the location and severity of the wound. A cut on the arm has one price. A cut on the leg has another. The lawman points out that Finn's cut did not break the bone. It did not expose cartilage. It was, legally speaking, a minor flesh wound. The law code lists a very small fine for such a wound, perhaps only a few ounces of silver. Rolf protests. He says the fine should be higher because the wound is on his face. It's a mark of shame. But Finn's advocate has an answer for that too. The law is silent on the matter of shame. It does not set a price for humiliation. It only sets a price for physical damage. The nose is just flesh and cartilage like an ear or a finger. There is no special legal category for wounds that cause embarrassment. The judges are stuck. They can see the justice of Rolf's complaint. The intent behind the wound was clearly malicious and designed to humiliate. But their job is to interpret the law as it is written. And the law is a cold, clinical list of body parts and silver values. It has no room for hurt feelings. They are forced to rule in Finn's favor. They order him to pay the small, legally mandated fine for a shallow flesh wound. Finn pays it immediately. He has satisfied the law. He walks away having inflicted a lasting, deeply personal humiliation on his rival for the price of a single sheep. He exploited the fact that the legal system was designed to compensate for the loss of a body's function, not for the wounding of a man's pride. Number 9, the thrall did it, but the master gave the order. Slavery, or thralldom, was a fundamental part of Viking society. Thralls were property. They had almost no legal rights. They could be bought and sold. Their children were born into slavery. A thrall who committed a crime was treated harshly. If a thrall stole something, he could be flogged. If he killed a free man, he was usually killed immediately with no trial or compensation paid. This created a complex legal situation. What happened if a master ordered his thrall to commit a crime? Who was legally responsible? The thrall who held the weapon, or the master who gave the command? The law tried to address this, but it was a gray area, and a ruthless man could exploit it. Picture a chieftain named Harold. It is the late 10th century. Harold has a political rival, another chieftain named Olaf. Harald wants Olaf dead, but he doesn't want to be blamed for the killing and start a blood feud with Olaf's powerful family. A direct attack is too risky, so Harold devises a plan. He owns a thrall named Kark. Kark is a strong man captured in a raid in Ireland years ago. He is loyal to Harold, who treats him better than most masters treat their thralls. Harold calls Kark to him in private. He does not say go and kill Olaf. That would be a direct, provable order. Instead, he speaks in hints and suggestions. He tells Kark how much trouble Olaf is causing him. He says that things would be so much better if Olaf were simply to disappear. He talks about Olaf's daily routines, how he often walks alone by the river in the evenings. Then Harold offers Kark a unique prize, his freedom. He tells Kark that if he proves himself to be truly useful and loyal, he will be made a free man. Kark understands perfectly what is being asked of him. The promise of freedom is the greatest gift a thrall could ever receive. A few nights later, Kark ambushes Olaf by the river and kills him with an axe. Kark then flees into the wilderness. Olaf's family is in an uproar. They quickly discover that it was Harold's thrall, Kark, who was the killer. They go to the Althing and accuse Harold of masterminding the murder. They demand that Harold pay the Wergild for Olaf, a massive sum of silver. Harald, in court, plays the part of a shocked and grieving man. He admits that Kark was his thrall. He admits that Kark killed Olaf. But he flatly denies giving the order. He produces witnesses, his own household staff, who swear they never heard Harold command Kark to do any such thing. He then presents his clever legal argument. He claims Kark acted on his own. He suggests Kark may have had some personal grudge against Olaf. Or perhaps, he says, Kark was simply a madman. According to the law, a master was not always responsible for the unpredictable actions of his property. If a man's ox gored someone, he might have to pay a fine, but he wouldn't be accused of murder. Harold argues that Kark, as his property, acted on his own violent impulse. Olaf's family argues back that no thrall would dare kill a powerful chieftain without his master's order. It's unbelievable, but they have no proof. They have no witnesses who heard the order. It is their word against Harold's. Harold then makes a show of righteousness. He says that since his thrall committed this terrible crime, he will do the lawful thing. He publicly disowns Kark, he declares him an outlaw, he gives Olaf's family the right to hunt Kark down and kill him like an animal. This, he argues, is the proper legal remedy. The crime was committed by the thrall, so the thrall must be the one who is punished. The judges at the Althing are in a bind. Everyone suspects Harold is lying, but suspicion is not evidence. The law needs proof of the command. Without it, the legal responsibility falls on the person who swung the axe. And that person was a piece of property, a thrall. The court rules that Harold is not legally guilty of murder. Olaf's family gets the right to hunt down and kill a runaway thrall, which is small comfort for the loss of a chieftain. Harold, meanwhile, has eliminated his rival at no personal cost. He might later arrange for Kark to be quietly captured and killed to tie up the loose end, or even help him escape to another country. He used the ambiguous legal status of a thrall as a shield. The thrall was a person when it came to committing the act, but mere property when it came to assigning the ultimate blame. Number 8, the truce was only valid inside the ropes. The Althing and other regional assemblies were considered sacred spaces. During the time the assembly was in session, a general truce or grid was in effect. It was a time of peace. All ongoing feuds were supposed to be put on hold. Violence within the sacred boundaries of the thing was a heinous crime punishable by the harshest form of outlawry. The boundaries of the thing were not just symbolic. They were often physically marked out, sometimes with ropes or stones, creating a holy ground for the law. This created a very literal loophole. The peace was only guaranteed inside the boundaries. What you did a few feet outside of them was a different matter. In the year 1011, two powerful families from the west of Iceland were in the middle of a bitter feud. The conflict had started over a stolen horse and had escalated to killings on both sides. The heads of the families were a man named Gunnar and a man named Thorstein. Both had come to the Althing with large followings, and everyone was nervous. Inside the boundaries of the thing, they had to be civil. Their men glared at each other across the fields, but no weapons were drawn. The law speaker had formally declared the grid, and to break it would mean ruin. Both Gunnar and Thorstein were at the Althing to prosecute each other for the previous killings in their feud. Gunnar was a patient and cunning man. He saw a way to strike a blow against Thorstein without technically breaking the truce of the thing. He knew that the truce was tied to the physical location. He had his men watch Thorstein's son, a young man of 20 named Bjarni. Bjarni was arrogant and careless. One evening, after a long day of legal arguments, Bjarni and two of his friends decided to leave the main camp at the Althing. They wanted to go for a ride to visit some women at a nearby farm. To get there, they had to cross the river that formed one of the natural boundaries of the assembly ground. Gunnar's spies reported this to him immediately. Gunnar gathered a dozen of his best fighters. They did not attack Bjarni within the camp. They waited. They moved quietly through the twilight and hid themselves in a small ravine just on the other side of the river. They were now a few hundred paces outside the sacred ground of the Althing when Bjarni and his friends rode across the shallow ford in the river. They were relaxed. They were laughing and talking, feeling safe, so close to the assembly. As soon as their horses' hooves touched the far bank, Gunnar and his men sprang their ambush. The fight was short and brutal. Bjarni and his friends were outnumbered and taken by surprise. They were all killed. And Gunnar and his men did not try to hide what they had done. They rode back to their own camp. The next morning, news of the killing spread through the Althing like fire. Thorstein was mad with grief and rage. He went before the law speaker and accused Gunnar of breaking the sacred truce and committing murder at the thing. And Gunnar was summoned before the law rock. He did not deny the killings. He admitted everything. But he presented a simple and unassailable defense. He asked Thorstein's own men to confirm where the attack had taken place. They had to admit it was on the far side of the river, and Gunnar then addressed the judges. The grid of the Althing extends to its boundaries. We all know this. I and my men were careful. We did not draw a weapon or speak a harsh word inside this holy place. We waited until Thorstein's son had left the sanctuary. The moment he crossed the river, he was no longer under the protection of the Thing's peace. He was just a man in the middle of a feud, and we dealt with him as such. His logic was monstrous, but it was legally sound. He had not broken the specific law against violence at the Althing. He had simply waited until his target had stepped 1 foot outside the magic circle of its protection. The judges could not declare him an outlaw for breaking the truce. He hadn't. They had to treat the killings as just another move in the ongoing feud between the two families. It would be handled in court the following year, or settled with more violence. By being extremely literal about the law, Gunnar had managed to commit a shocking act of violence during the time of peace, and he did it without breaking the most important rule of the assembly. He exploited the geography of the law. Number 7, she was a concubine, not a wife, so the children inherit nothing. Inheritance, or arf, was a source of constant conflict in the Viking world. The laws were designed to keep property, especially ancestral land odel, within the family. Sons inherited from their fathers. If there were no sons, daughters could inherit. The system was based on legitimate, lawful marriage. A formal marriage, a munder, involved a contract. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family. The bride's family provided a dowry. It was a public, legally recognized agreement. The children of such a marriage were legitimate heirs. But many powerful men also had concubines, or frilla. These were long-term, publicly acknowledged relationships. A man might live with a concubine for years, even have many children with her. Socially, she might be treated almost like a wife. But legally, she was not. There had been no formal contract, no bride price paid. The children of a concubine were illegitimate. They had very few legal rights. They could not inherit their father's primary property. This legal distinction could be used as a cruel but effective weapon in family disputes. In the year 960 in Norway, a wealthy landowner and ship owner named Bjorn the Old was dying. Bjorn had lived for 30 years with a woman named Astrid. They had 3 strong sons together. Everyone in the district knew them as a family. Astrid ran his household. His sons worked on his ships and managed his lands. Bjorn always referred to Astrid as his wife and to the boys as his heirs. Bjorn, however, had a younger brother named Ulfar. Ulfar was greedy and knew the law. He knew that Bjorn and Astrid had never been formally married. They had simply started living together when they were young. No bride price was ever paid. When Bjorn died, Ulfar made his move. As Bjorn's sons prepared to take over the farm and the ships, Ulfar brought a case to the local Gulating assembly. He claimed that he, as Bjorn's only legitimate male relative, was the rightful heir to all of Bjorn's property. Astrid's sons were shocked. They stood before the court and said they were Bjorn's children. They had lived their whole lives on that land. Their father had always intended for them to inherit. They brought dozens of witnesses from the community who swore that Bjorn had always treated Astrid as his wife and the boys as his sons. Then Ulfar's lawman stood to speak. He did not dispute that the boys were Bjorn's biological children. He did not dispute that Bjorn and Astrid had lived together. He asked a single, simple question to Astrid. Was a bride price, a munder, ever paid by Bjorn's family to your family for your hand in marriage? Astrid, an honest woman, had to admit that it had not. The lawman then turned to the judges. His argument was devastatingly simple. This woman, he said, pointing to Astrid, was Bjorn's frilla, not his wife. Therefore her sons are illegitimate. The law is perfectly clear. Illegitimate sons cannot inherit odal land. The property must pass to the nearest legitimate male kin. That man is my client, Ulfar, the deceased's brother. The judges were faced with a clear conflict between social reality and legal doctrine. Socially, the boys were Bjorn's heirs. Legally, they were not. The community's perception did not matter. Bjorn's intentions did not matter. All that mattered was the missing legal formality from 30 years before. The lack of a marriage contract, a single business transaction, invalidated the claims of his children. The court had no choice but to rule in favor of Ulfar. He inherited everything. The farm, the ships, the wealth. Bjorn's sons, who had worked their whole lives to build up that wealth, were left with nothing. They were legally dispossessed. They could keep their personal belongings, their clothes, and their weapons, but they were forced to leave their home. Ulfar had used a legal loophole to disinherit his own nephews. He exploited the rigid distinction between a socially recognized family and a legally recognized one. The law cared about contracts, not relationships. By enforcing this distinction, he was able to seize an entire fortune. Number 6. He was technically a guest, not a resident. The concept of a legal residence, or heimili, was very important in Viking law. A person's legal residence determined where they would be prosecuted for crimes. It was where a summons had to be delivered. It was the center of their legal identity. The law was specific to establish a legal residence. A farmer had to have his main fire and his bed in a place for a certain period of time. This created a loophole for people who were constantly on the move, or for those who wanted to avoid legal responsibility. By carefully managing where you slept and ate, you could make it very difficult for the law to catch up with you. Consider the case of a Norwegian trader named Magnus, who spent his summers in Iceland in the early 11th century. Magnus was a sharp dealer and not always honest. He made a deal with an Icelandic farmer, Thorir, to buy a large amount of wool. And Magnus took delivery of the wool, but never paid the agreed price. He then sailed back to Norway for the winter. Thorir was furious. He wanted to prosecute Magnus, but Magnus was gone. The next summer, Magnus returned to Iceland. He didn't set up his own farm. Instead, he stayed as a guest at the home of a powerful chieftain who was his business partner. He slept in the chieftain's longhouse and ate at his table. He conducted his business from there, but he owned no land and had no house of his own. Thorir decided to act. He knew he had to summon Magnus to the Althing to get his money. He and his witnesses went to the chieftain's farm where Magnus was staying. He stood before the door and formally summoned Magnus. When the case came to court at the Althing, Magnus's advocate immediately challenged the summons. He did not argue about the debt, he argued about jurisdiction. He asked Thorir, where is Magnus's legal residence, his heimili in Iceland? Thorir replied that it was at the chieftain's farm, as that was where he lived. Magnus's advocate shook his head. He argued that Magnus was merely a guest, a jester. He had not established a legal residence. His true heimili was his farm back in Norway. Therefore, Thorir had delivered the summons to the wrong place. To be legally valid, the summons had to be delivered at Magnus's home in Norway. This was, of course, an impossible requirement. Thorir could not sail to Norway just to deliver a piece of paper. The advocate was arguing that Magnus, while physically present in Iceland and doing business there, was not legally present for the purposes of a lawsuit. Thorir argued that this was absurd. Magnus was right there in the court. How could he not be subject to its laws? But the law of procedure was strict. A case had to begin with a valid summons at a legal residence. The advocate argued that the chieftain's home was not, and had never been, Magnus's legal home. He was just visiting. The judges had to consider the letter of the law. Had Magnus established a heimili? He had not. He had no farm, no fire of his own. He was transient. Legally, he was a foreigner with no fixed address in Iceland. The court, bound by this technicality, had to rule that the summons was invalid. The case was dismissed. And Magnus was free to go. He had used his status as a guest to place himself above the law of the land he was in. He could conduct business, make promises, and incur debts, but when it came time to be held accountable, he could claim that he didn't legally live there. It was a perfect loophole for merchants, mercenaries, and anyone else who moved between different legal districts. By avoiding a permanent address, they could avoid legal consequences. Number 5. The oath was sworn on the wrong kind of ring. Oaths were the bedrock of the Norse legal system. In a world with little written evidence, a person's sworn word was a primary form of proof. But not just any oath would do. A legally binding oath had to be performed with an exact ritual. The most solemn kind of oath was the Baugrigr, or ring oath. The law specified that for this oath, a person had to stand in a designated sacred space. They had to be holding a specific object, usually a silver arm ring that had been consecrated at a temple. The ring had to be of a certain weight, usually 2 ounces or more, and it had to be unstained by blood. The person swearing the oath had to speak a precise, formal wording, calling on the gods as witnesses. If any part of this ritual was performed incorrectly, the oath was legally void. This obsession with ritual created an opportunity for deception. In a dispute over cattle ownership in the year 999, a farmer named Brand accused his neighbor Leif of rebranding several of his calves and adding them to his own herd. As Brand had some evidence, but it wasn't conclusive. The case came down to Leif's word against his. The judges at the local thing decided that the only way to resolve the matter was for Leif to swear a Baugrigr that the cattle were his. Leif agreed. If he swore the oath and no one could prove he was lying, he would win the case. Brand was worried. He was sure Leif was guilty and was about to swear a false oath. A false oath was a terrible sin and a crime, but proving it was another matter. The day of the oath-taking arrived. The assembly gathered. The local gaudy, or priest chieftain, prepared the ritual. He brought out a heavy silver arm ring from the temple. It was the official oath ring for the district. It was placed on the altar stone. Leif was called forward. He was about to step into the sacred circle and take the oath. But just before he did, a friend of Brand, a man known for his sharp eyes and knowledge of the law, stepped forward and asked to inspect the ring. This was an unusual request, but not forbidden. The friend picked up the ring. He looked at it closely. He held it up to the light. Then he turned to the judges. "This is not the correct ring," he announced. The Godi was insulted. He insisted it was the temple ring, but Brand's friend pointed to a tiny scratch on the inside of the band. "The true oath ring of this district," he said, "was damaged in a fire 10 years ago. It has a small black mark from the smoke on the inside. I have seen it many times. This ring has no such mark. This is a different ring." An uproar ensued. The Godi, flustered, admitted that the original ring had been misplaced. He had substituted another silver ring from the temple's treasury, thinking no one would notice. It was of the same weight and value, but it was not the specific, consecrated ring the law required. Leif's planned oath was now impossible. He could not swear on a false ring. His entire defense had rested on his ability to perform this ritual. His Brand's friend had not proven that Leif was a thief. He had simply proven that the legal instrument for proving his innocence was faulty. The court was at an impasse. Since Leif could not now swear the required oath, suspicion fell heavily upon him. The judges, influenced by this procedural failure, ruled in Brand's favor. They ordered Leif to return the cattle and pay a fine. Leif may well have been planning to swear a false oath, but he was defeated not by evidence of his crime, but by a technicality of the ritual. The law was so focused on the precise form of the oath, the exact words, the exact place, and the exact object, that a small deviation could bring an entire case crashing down. The loophole was not in the substance of the law, but in the magic of its performance. Number 4, the charge was escalated from theft to a capital crime. Norse law had a concept called sakkarokning, which roughly means charge increase or case escalation. It was a legal tactic where a prosecutor could, through a series of procedural steps, elevate a minor offense into a much more serious one. This was often used to apply maximum pressure on a defendant, turning a simple dispute over property into a matter of life and death or outlawry. Let's say a farmer Orm finds his neighbor Ivar cutting down trees in a section of forest that Orm claims as his own. This is a trespass and a theft of timber. Normally, the penalty would be a fine, the value of the wood plus some compensation. But Orm hates Ivar. He doesn't just want a fine. He wants to ruin him. He decides to use Sakarokning. First, Orm prosecutes Ivar not just for the theft of the wood, but for a more serious crimelandnam, or unlawful seizure of land. He argues that by cutting down the trees, Ivar was asserting ownership over the disputed territory. This is a more serious charge, with a higher fine. And Ivar, at the local thing, denies the charge. He claims the land is his. He refuses to pay the fine Orm demands. This refusal is the key. By refusing a judgment, Ivar is, in Orm's view, defying the law itself. This allows Orm to take the next step. He can now summon Ivar to the Althing, the highest court, on a new charge. The charge is no longer about the trees. The new charge is that Ivar is a man who refuses to abide by the judgments of his local thing. He is defying the legal order. At the Althing, Orm's powerful chieftain and lawman take over. They frame Ivar as a rebellious, lawless man. They present his refusal to pay the initial fine as evidence that he has no respect for the community or its laws. They demand that the court declare Ivar a lesser outlaw Fjordbug's for this defiance. Ivar, a simple farmer without powerful friends, is now in serious trouble. And a case about a few trees has become a case about his status as a member of society. He protests. He says he only refused to pay because he believed he was in the right. But the process has its own momentum. Let's say the court at the Althing agrees to the lesser outlawry. Ivar is now a criminal. He is ordered to pay a huge fine and is banished for 3 years. If he fails to pay the fine or leave the country by the appointed time, his status automatically escalates again. He becomes a full outlaw Skoganger. Now Orm has achieved his goal. Ivar is ruined. If he stays, he can be killed on sight. His property is forfeit. Orm can now claim the disputed forest, and all of Ivar's farm besides. Orm did this by taking a small initial crime and using every refusal, every legal challenge from his opponent as a rung on a ladder to a more serious charge. The original dispute about the trees is almost forgotten. The final crime is Ivar's failure to navigate the legal system correctly. The system allowed a prosecutor to pile legal charges on top of each other, so that a defendant could be crushed not by the weight of his original crime, but by the weight of the procedure used against him. Number 3, the appeal was sent to a court he invented. For much of the early Viking Age in Iceland, the legal system was relatively flat. There were local things and the Althing, but there wasn't a formal court of appeals. If a court was deadlocked, or if one party felt the judgment was deeply unfair, the only recourse was often violence. Around the year 1005, this became a major problem. Powerful chieftains were able to stack the local courts with their own supporters, ensuring they always won. Cases at the Althing often ended in stalemates when the two sides were evenly matched in power. The system was breaking down. A very clever legal reformer, a man named Njal Thorgerson, is credited in the sagas with proposing a solution. He suggested the creation of a new higher court, the Fifth Court, or Fimtartamor. This court would act as a court of appeals. It would hear cases that could not be resolved in the lower courts. The judges in this court would be required to swear an oath to rule strictly on the law and the evidence, not on their personal loyalties. This seemed like a great reform, but in practice, it created a new and powerful loophole for the rich and legally savvy. The procedures for appealing to the Fifth Court were new and complex. A chieftain who understood them could use the court to overturn legitimate verdicts from lower courts. Imagine a case in the year 1015. A farmer, a man of modest means named Thorhall, successfully prosecutes a wealthy chieftain's son for stealing his prize bull. The evidence is clear, and the local court rules in Thorhall's favor, ordering a large fine. The chieftain is furious. He cannot accept this public humiliation. His son lost a case to a common farmer. At the Althing, he announces he is appealing the verdict to the new Fifth Court. This is where the manipulation begins. The rules for the Fifth Court are still being worked out. The chieftain's lawman, an expert in these new procedures, finds a series of technical errors in how the original case was conducted. He claims that one of the judges in the lower court was distantly related to Thorhall's wife, a fact no one had noticed. He claims that the summons was delivered an hour too early in the morning. He brings up a list of tiny procedural flaws. These flaws were not enough to get the case thrown out of the lower court, but they are enough to form the basis of an appeal. The chieftain's lawman argues that because of these errors, the original verdict is legally unsound and must be overturned by the Fifth Court. Thorhall is now in over his head. He understood the laws of his local thing, but this new Fifth Court is a different world. It is a place for legal experts, a game of procedure and technicality. He cannot afford to hire a lawman as skilled as the chieftains. In the Fifth Court, the case is no longer about the stolen bull. It is about the subtle points of legal procedure. The chieftain's lawman gives a long, brilliant speech, quoting obscure passages from the law code. He confuses and intimidates the judges. The Fifth Court, bound to rule on the legal merits of the appeal, is forced to agree that the original trial had procedural flaws. They overturn the verdict. They do not rule that the chieftain's son is innocent. They simply rule that his conviction was legally improper. The fine is cancelled. The chieftain has won. He used the appeals process not to find justice, but to escape it. The Fifth Court, which was designed to be a failsafe for the legal system, became a tool for the powerful. It allowed them to get a second chance to fight the case again on a different battlefield, one where legal knowledge and money mattered more than the simple truth of a crime. Number 2, the killer was prosecuted by the wrong person. The right to prosecute a killing, to demand wurgild or outlawry, did not belong to the state. It belonged to the victim's family. The law was extremely specific about who had this right. It was a strict hierarchy. The primary prosecutor was the victim's son. If he had no son, it was his father. If his father was dead, it was his brother. The list went on through uncles, first cousins, and second cousins. You had to be the closest male relative in the legally defined line to be the principal prosecutor. If the wrong person initiated the case, the entire prosecution was invalid. This created a loophole that could be used to derail a murder case completely. In the Eyrbyggja saga, there is a complex legal battle that illustrates this perfectly. A man named Arnkel Godi is killed by his rival Snorri Godi and Snorri's followers. Arnkel was a powerful chieftain, and his murder was a major event. Everyone knew Snorri was responsible. The Arnkel had a father, Thorolf, and he also had cousins. According to the law, Arnkel's father, Thorolf, was the correct person to lead the prosecution. But Thorolf was a very old and passive man. He was not a great warrior or legal expert. He was overwhelmed by the situation. Arnkel's cousins, however, were young and aggressive. They wanted revenge. They decided to take charge of the case themselves. They gathered support, prepared the charges, and went to the Althing to prosecute Snorri. They were the ones who formally named Snorri as the killer. Snorri, one of the most brilliant legal minds in Iceland, saw his opening. In court, he did not even try to argue his innocence. He did not talk about the circumstances of the killing. His entire defense was a procedural one. His lawyer stood up and asked a simple question: who is the prosecutor in this case? Arnkel's cousins proudly stood up and said that they were. Snorri's lawyer then asked, is the victim's father, Thorolf, still alive? And they had to admit that he was. The trap was sprung. Snorri's lawyer then stated the law: the right to prosecute belonged to the father first. The cousins only had the right to prosecute if the father was dead. Since Thorolf was alive, the cousins had no legal standing. They were the wrong plaintiffs. The cousins were enraged. They argued that the father was too old and weak to lead the case. They had taken on the duty for the sake of the family's honor. But the law did not care about practicality or honor. It cared about the strict formal line of succession. The court had no choice but to agree with Snorri. The entire case, which had been prepared for months, was declared invalid. It was dismissed on the spot. Snorri and his men, who were clearly guilty of killing Arnkell, walked free from the court because the wrong relative had brought the charges. There was no case. While Snorri had gotten away with murder by exploiting the legal hierarchy of grief. He wasn't innocent, but he was, for the moment, immune to prosecution. The law designed to ensure that the correct family member sought justice had become a shield to prevent any justice from being done at all. Number 1, he legally declared his own punishment. The story of Bjorn the Bull at the Althing in 1010 reveals the most audacious loophole in all of Norse law, the sjálfdæmi, or self-judgment. It was a procedure so ripe for abuse that it's a wonder it existed at all. It placed the power of sentencing not in the hands of neutral judges, but in the hands of the guilty party. To understand why it existed, one must understand the central purpose of Viking law to prevent or end feuds. The system was less about abstract justice and more about conflict resolution. Sometimes, the only way to stop a war between two powerful families was to find a solution that allowed both sides to save face. Sjálfdæmi was supposed to be a tool for this. The idea was that a powerful man, by admitting guilt and setting his own presumably fair punishment, could show honor and magnanimity, thus ending the dispute. But the powerful are not always magnanimous. Let's return to Bjorn the Bull. His crime was clear. He had killed Einar's son, Steinthor. The standard wergild for a man of Steinthor's standing was 200 marks of silver, a fortune that would cripple even a wealthy chieftain. Full outlawry was the other possibility. Bjorn faced ruin or death. His genius was to see that his military power at the Althing could be converted into legal power. He had brought 300 men. Einar had 80. The other chieftains, the ones who acted as judges and mediators, were afraid. They saw the simmering violence and knew a battle at the Thing would be a disaster for the entire Icelandic Commonwealth. Bjorn's proposal of self-judgment was a threat wrapped in a legal procedure. He was saying, you can either let me resolve this my way, or my 300 men will resolve it their way. He was using the fear of a feud to force the hand of the very legal system designed to prevent feuds. When the chieftains pressured Einar to accept the sjálfdæmi, they were making a political calculation, not a legal one. They were sacrificing the justice of one man's case for the perceived stability of the whole assembly. Einar was trapped. If he refused, he would be blamed for the battle that would follow. His 80 men would be slaughtered. He had to agree. The moment Einar consented, the legal landscape shifted entirely. The question was no longer, what is the lawful punishment for this crime? The question became, what punishment will Bjorn deign to inflict upon himself? Bjorn's declaration of a 3 silver mark fine was a masterstroke of cynical legalism. It was a punishment. It was a number. He paid it. On a purely technical level, he had fulfilled the requirements of the self-judgment. He had judged himself, and he had abided by that judgment. The case was now closed. The law had been satisfied. But the social contract had been shattered. Everyone present knew it was a farce. Bjorn had used the letter of the law to mock its spirit. He had taken a tool designed for honorable compromise and used it as a bludgeon of power. He demonstrated that in this legal system, if you had enough swords, the law became whatever you said it was. You could literally write your own verdict. This was the ultimate loophole. It wasn't about misinterpreting a minor rule or exploiting a procedural error. It was about using raw power to seize control of the legal mechanism itself, turning it from a tool of justice into a public ritual of dominance. Bjorn walked away a free man, not because he was innocent, but because he was powerful enough to make the law declare him so, for the price of a single cow.